Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. This week, Donald Trump was indicted on felony charges. No, this is not a rerun. Well, today's show is not a rerun. The Democrats' politicized weaponization of government against the leading candidate to take on their incompetent, half-brain-dead incumbent is a rerun. And this one is as disgusting and as unlawful as two of the other three are. The indictment for mishandling of classified information is also a politically motivated prosecution, and really persecution, not prosecution. But at least what Trump was charged with in that case stemmed from actions that could possibly be illegal. I'm not saying what he did was illegal, but the charges in New York for paying hush money to Stormy Daniels, and the charges in Washington over the events of January 6, 2021 at the Capitol were 100% fabricated by dishonest and dangerous prosecutors who stretched both law and credulity to gin up phony criminal allegations against the former president. And it is all part of a well-orchestrated scheme, aided by the activists posing as journalists in the fake news, to eliminate Donald Trump as a viable candidate for the presidency in the 2024 general election. I have quoted Lavrenti Beria before while describing the persecution of Donald Trump. Beria was the chief of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs in the Soviet Union during Joseph Stalin's reign of terror. And the words I quote him saying are, "Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime." Those words perfectly describe how the Soviet government apparatchik would weaponize government to eliminate people who posed a threat to the Communist Party. And those words perfectly describe how the Demon Rat Party apparatchik has weaponized government to eliminate people who pose a threat to the Communist Party. The Democrat Party. Sorry for that, but you can certainly understand how easy it is to make such a mistake. Because the tactics and goals the Democrats use today are the same kinds of tactics the communists used in the Soviet Union. And they're used for the same reason, to eliminate opposition so they can rule with absolute power. And if reaching that goal requires eviscerating the constitutional rights of Americans, so be it. To Democrats, the ends justify the means, and they will let nothing, not even the Constitution of the United States, get in the way of total, absolute, and unquestioned power. These new charges in Georgia, like the charges in New York and the charges in the District of Columbia, have no merit whatsoever. They are a flagrant attempt to make criminal the very justified questioning of Georgia's official election results. It is a political persecution, not a criminal prosecution. And it's disgusting and dangerous. And it should have no place in a free constitutional republic. But when demon rats rule, the Constitution becomes irrelevant. Under normal circumstances, when a crime is known to have been committed, an investigation is launched to determine who committed it. But in the case of Donald Trump, the demon rats targeted him and conducted a search to find his crime. This week's indictment in Georgia was the fourth time in less than 5 months the former president has been charged with felonies. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announced his indictment of Donald Trump on April 4th over hush money payments he made to Stormy Daniels. On June 9th, Special Counsel Jack Smith announced his indictment against Donald Trump over his retention of classified documents. He later expanded those charges on July 27th to include new obstruction charges. On August 1st, Jack Smith handed up new indictments by a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. over what happened on January 6th. And then on Monday of this week, August 14th, Fani Willis, the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, that's where Atlanta is, indicted Donald Trump on charges that he engaged in criminal conspiracy in an attempt to overturn Georgia's presidential election results of 2020. So does this latest indictment show Donald Trump committed crimes? No, not at all. Those jumping to such a conclusion have no knowledge of how grand juries work in general and no knowledge of this indictment's specifics. But I'll address those when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Let's not forget what a grand jury is. It's not a trial jury who are there to determine the facts and to determine guilt or innocence. A grand jury is only there to determine whether or not there is probable cause to charge someone with a crime. And the threshold for achieving probable cause is incredibly low. The prosecutor gets to tell the grand jurors whatever he wants, or in this case, she wants, and there's no rebuttal. Unlike a trial jury where the jury hears evidence from the prosecutor and the defense attorney, along with cross-examinations in an adversarial process, a grand jury hears only from the prosecutor. So if the prosecutor wants an indictment, the prosecutor gets an indictment, almost always. But that doesn't mean the accused is guilty, nor does it mean the charges are even legitimate under the law. But reaching a verdict of guilt or innocence takes time. And both the time and the timing illustrate the real reasons Donald Trump has been charged, not just in Georgia, but in all 4 jurisdictions where rogue partisan prosecutors have charged him. Monday's indictment in Georgia is Trump's 4th indictment in less than 5 months. He faces 34 state felony counts in New York over his hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. He faces 40 felony counts in federal court in Florida over his handling of classified documents. He faces 4 federal felony counts in Washington, D.C. over the January 6th riot. And he faces 13 state felony counts in Georgia for allegedly trying to overturn the 2020 election results. That's a total of 91 felonies. The 13 in Georgia are based on such a deliberately broad misinterpretation of the law and his actions that they have no merit whatsoever. But if Donald Trump goes to trial in any of those jurisdictions, he will absolutely be convicted of at least some of those felonies. But the Democrats' goal is not to put Donald Trump behind bars. Now, make no mistake, they'd love to see it happen. But the goal is not to put him in prison. The goal is to keep him out of the White House. And by extension, to keep any Republican out of the White House. And since Donald Trump is certain to win the Republican primary and be the Republican nominee in the 2024 general election for president, his defeat will keep a Democrat in the Oval Office. That is the goal. That is what they want. That is why they have weaponized government against Donald Trump. And they're going to succeed, at least as it pertains to the 2024 election in the near term. These prosecutions will result in the Democrat candidate winning the presidency in 2024. Now, as I said, I fully expect Donald Trump to be convicted of felonies. But that's at the trial court level. I expect he will get those convictions, the federal ones anyway, overturned on appeal. The state ones? Man, I don't know. State appellate courts are far more partisan than federal appellate courts. So while I would expect the federal appellate courts to properly throw out the trial court convictions, the state appellate courts are almost certain to uphold them. Now, that doesn't mean Trump would have no options. State court decisions can be overturned by federal courts based on constitutional challenges because of state court violations of constitutional protections, but none of those appeals will be final until well after Donald Trump loses the 2024 presidential election, and there's no remedy for the demon rat's second theft of the presidency from Donald Trump. And arguably the third theft of his presidency, if we count the well-orchestrated Russia collusion hoax that the demon rats and their apparatchik in the FBI and intelligence services deliberately and maliciously and illegally used to hamper the entirety of his first term. But for now, let's focus on the demon rat plan to steal the 2024 election from Donald Trump. By lying about Trump's role in the January 6th riot at the Capitol, by calling it an insurrection, even though it absolutely was not one, by unconstitutionally holding an impeachment trial in the Senate after Trump left office, by the House conducting one-sided so-called hearings into the actions leading up to and including the January 6th riot, by fabricating evidence presented at those hearings, by these 91 felony charges being brought against him by activist prosecutors abusing their power to weaponize their offices, and with the so-called journalists and the fake news amplifying the demon rat propaganda, Donald Trump has already been set up to lose the election in 2024. And to lose it bigly. So what are the new felony charges against Trump and his associates? I'll go through some of them when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. This week's 13-count indictment against Donald Trump alleges he engaged in a criminal conspiracy to overturn Georgia's election results of 2020. But it wasn't just the former president who was charged. 18 others were included in the 98-page indictment, all of which I read. Trump's former White House chief of staff, Mark Meadows, was indicted. He's accused of giving Donald Trump the phone number for Frances Watson. She was the chief investigator of the Investigations Division for the Georgia Secretary of State. Trump then called her. That's a crime? Where are all the imprisoned 411 operators who have given people phone numbers? Okay, I guess that shows my age. But where are all the imprisoned coders for Google's search engines? What, it's illegal to give somebody a phone number? Meadows was also indicted because he participated in the January 2nd, 2021 phone call between Trump and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which Trump asked Raffensperger to find, that's a key word, to find 11,780 votes. Now, I wrote about that call at great length back in January of 2021, and I explained how there was nothing illegal about it. Now, I don't have time to rehash it today, but the blog post about it is online at www.themikebatesshow.com. The blog was posted January 4th, 2021. 2 days after the call was made, and importantly, after I listened to the call myself and didn't just accept the dishonest reporting the fake news said was in the call. You can easily scroll to that date and read it if you're interested in the full explanation. But the short explanation is that asking the Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes is not the same as asking the Secretary of State to fabricate 11,780 votes. Donald Trump honestly thought that there were at least 11,779 illegal votes for Biden that were counted in Georgia's presidential election, or that there were 11,780 uncounted votes for him. And if Raffensperger found those votes and could prove they were illegally counted or illegally not counted, as the case may have been, then Trump would have been declared the winner in Georgia. And despite what the demon rats and their allies in the fake news said, there is nothing illegal about such a request. As was, and still is, typical, when Trump is involved, the activists posing as journalists in the propaganda press lied about what Trump said to Raffensperger. The fake news only reported a small fraction of that call, and they grossly misrepresented what was said in it. It was very clear throughout the entire phone call that President Trump truly believed he had won Georgia, and that all he wanted was an investigation that would discover the truth, whatever that truth may have been. Contrary to how the fake news reported it, President Trump never asked Raffensperger to commit election fraud. Ever. Not once did President Trump ask him to throw out any legitimate ballots, fabricate any fake ballots, falsify any records, or commit any kind of election fraud whatsoever. All the president asked for was an investigation into the allegations of election malfeasance, which he believed, if found, would result in a Trump victory. Near the end of that call, President Trump summed up what he wanted done. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Brad, we just want the truth. It's simple, and everyone's going to look very good if the truth comes out. That's okay. It'll take a little while, but let the truth come out. End quote. Have you seen that anywhere in the fake news? No, of course not. Instead, you've heard that Trump asked Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to commit election fraud, which is a total and complete lie. Trump never even came close to doing that. My blog post, by the way, includes a link to the audio recording of that entire 62-minute phone call between Trump and Raffensperger, so you can listen to exactly what Trump said with his own words, unfiltered by the fake news. You really should go read that blog post and then listen to the recording of the phone call. You'll not only learn the truth about what happened, you'll also learn just how dishonestly the lying bastards in the fake news portrayed it. Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani was indicted in Georgia. The charges? During legislative hearings in Atlanta in December of 2020, Giuliani said there was widespread election fraud in Georgia. Was there? It's never been proven. But it's not a crime to state it if you actually believe it happened. Giuliani was also involved in the plan for 16 Georgia Republicans to sign as certified electors for Trump. Without that alternative slate of electors, Trump would certainly have lost any chance to be considered the lawful winner in Georgia. As it turns out, he wasn't anyway. But that alternate slate of electors was necessary to preserve his rights to seek remedy in court and in Congress. So there was nothing illegal about it. Contested electors have been submitted to Congress many times in American history. It's up to Congress to decide which set to certify. But without an alternative to certify, Congress wouldn't be able to make a choice. Now, they could refuse one set, and if they did that, that set wouldn't count, but there would be no alternative set to choose to certify. What Giuliani and the 16 people who signed as alternative electors did was perfectly legal. And if Fani Willis honestly believed those 16 people committed crimes, then why were only some and not all 16 indicted, huh? Jeffrey Clark, an official at the Justice Department, was indicted too. He was charged because he drafted a letter pushing Georgia lawmakers to convene a special legislative session to take action on the election results. But his superiors at the Justice Department wouldn't allow it to be sent. So according to Fani Willis, an attorney who writes a suggestion is now a criminal? Yep, that's what she charged him with. If an attorney writing a draft letter that doesn't even get sent is a criminal, then every attorney in America is a criminal. I'll avoid the temptation to make an obvious joke about that. Trump attorneys John Eastman, Sidney Powell, Kenneth Chesbrough, Jenna Willis, Ray Smith, and Robert Cheeley were also charged. But all they did was vigorously and within the law advocate on behalf of Trump that the election had not been properly conducted. So now practicing law is a criminal activity? Yeah, apparently it is when that practice tries to expose Democrat corruption. Michael Roman was charged. He was the director of Trump's Election Day operations in Georgia, and he tried to submit an alternate slate of electors for Congress to consider. Something that is not only perfectly lawful to do, but that numerous Democrats have done in the past. Where are those prosecutions, huh? David Schaefer was charged. He was the chairman of the Georgia GOP. He was among the 16 Republicans who met at the state capitol on December 14th, 2020, to sign a certificate declaring themselves as Georgia's duly elected and qualified electors to the Electoral College. Also, not a crime. It was a necessary step if Congress was to have an alternate slate of electors to certify on January 6th. It was pointless because the fix was already in, but it wasn't illegal. It's worth mentioning that David Schaefer is currently serving in the Georgia Senate. So this indictment is an attack on people in or seeking both federal and state offices. State Senator Sean Still was charged. He also signed that same certificate David Schaefer did. In 2020, he was the finance chairman for the state GOP, and was a delegate to the Republican National Convention. Kathy Latham was charged. She was the chairman of the Coffee County Republican Party. She also signed that certificate stating Trump had won Georgia and that the Republican electors were the rightful electors to the Electoral College. Stephen Lee was charged. He's a pastor in Georgia who publicly accused election worker Ruby Freeman of stuffing fraudulent ballots into the vote count. Now, if that accusation was untrue, then the poll worker has a right to sue for defamation. But defamation is a civil matter, not a criminal one. Harris Floyd was charged. He was the director of the organization Black Voices for Trump. The indictment accused him of recruiting Stephen Lee to arrange a meeting with election worker Ruby Freeman and with publicist Trevian Kutti. Who was Trevian Kutti? Well, she's a Chicago-based publicist who supported Trump. The indictment claims she pressured election worker Ruby Freeman to falsely confess to election fraud. But if Trevian Kutti honestly believed that Ruby Freeman had committed election fraud, then she didn't pressure her to falsely confess to election fraud. She pressured, or may have just asked, Ruby Freeman to truthfully confess to election fraud. So now asking someone to confess to a crime is a crime? Apparently it is when such a confession would expose Democrat fraud. Scott Hall was charged. He's a Georgia bail bondsman who, the indictment alleges, stole voting machine information in Coffee County, Georgia, that was the property of Dominion Voting Systems. Now, I don't know enough about that specific allegation to comment as to the veracity of it, but I will say that if he truly stole something, he should have been charged 2.5 years ago via regular procedures and not now as part of this politically motivated dragnet Fani Willis has conducted. But I bet he didn't really steal it. Why do I say that? Because Misty Hampton was also charged in Monday's indictment. Who was Misty Hampton? She was the elections director in Coffee County. She was at the Coffee County Elections Office on January 7th, 2021, when a computer forensics team copied election data and software code off the county's election equipment. Should she have permitted that download? Maybe, maybe not. But as the election director, if she had doubts that the election was lawfully conducted and that the computer system the county used was somehow used to alter the election results, isn't preserving a copy of that system's data and code prudent? Nobody's saying she tried to alter anything. She merely allowed the data and software to be preserved. I don't see how that could be a criminal act. It's no different than Xeroxing a document you believe to be fraudulent before the people you believe committed the fraud shred the original so they can deny it ever existed. And while it seems the voting systems were not used to generate false election results, the claims at the time were widely believed. Not by me, mind you. I all along have dismissed that as irrelevant and as impossible to prove. I've always based my assertion that the 2020 election was stolen upon the unconstitutional processes and procedures rather than outright organized fraud by election officials or by election software vendors. And none of those activities that Fani Willis has charged these people with appear to be anything more than legal efforts to question the outcome of an election that was, they genuinely believed, unlawfully conducted. Well, if questioning or trying to undo the official results of an election is a criminal act, then where are the indictments of Hillary Clinton and Democrat Congressman Jim McGovern, Jamie Raskin, Pramila Jayapal, Raul Grijalva, Sheila Jackson Lee, Barbara Lee, and Maxine Waters? In 2016, well, on January 6, 2017, but it was about the 2016 election, all those Democrat congressmen objected to some of Trump's Electoral College votes. But what is so pathetic is that most Americans and nearly all Democrats are completely unaware that even happened. Why? Because the leftist overlords and the fake news didn't spoon-feed them anger about it like they have with all these fake allegations against Trump and his supporters. And where are the arrests of Hollywood leftists Martin Sheen, Deborah Messing, Noah Weil, Mike Farrell, Loretta Swit, Bob Odenkirk, James Cromwell, B.D. Wong, Talia Balsam, Frida Payne, and Richard Schiff? In 2016, they all recorded a video urging Trump's electors to violate their oaths, and in some cases, depending on the states, commit felonies by refusing to cast their electoral college votes for Donald Trump. And if you don't like those examples because they're not specific to Georgia, then where's the indictment of Stacey Abrams? She has claimed that her loss in the 2018 Georgia governor's race was unlawful. And she didn't just claim that when it happened. She still claims the election was stolen from her. Hey, Fonnie Willis, where's your indictment of Stacey Abrams? Yeah, we all know that'll never happen. Stacey Abrams is a member of a special protected class. And by that, I don't mean black female. I mean Democrat. Stacey Abrams is a Democrat. And Democrats are allowed to get away with whatever political dishonesty they want. Because Democrat officials and Democrat bureaucrats have weaponized government with double standards that exempt Democrats from prosecution for dishonesty and unconstitutional acts, so long as what they do advances the causes of the Demon Rat Party and hurt the causes of the Republican Party. The charges against those 18 people plus Donald Trump allege they conspired to illegally overturn Georgia's 2020 election results and tried to prevent the peaceful transition of power to Biden via a criminal conspiracy of racketeering, violating the oath of a public officer, forgery, and false statements. The 98-page indictment lists 161 of these so-called offenses that comprise the conspiracy. Do you know what some of those acts are? You should read the entire indictment, but I'll share a few with you. Willis wants to criminalize speech. Seriously, have you read Criminal Act number 1? It says, this is a direct and full quote, on or about the 4th day of November 2020, Donald John Trump made a nationally televised speech falsely declaring victory in the 2020 presidential election. Approximately 4 days earlier, on or about October 31st, 2020, Donald John Trump discussed a draft speech with unindicted co-conspirator Individual 1, whose identity is known to the grand jury, that falsely declared victory and falsely claimed voter fraud. The speech was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. End quote. So Donald Trump's constitutionally guaranteed right to free speech was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy? Yeah, that's what the indictment says. Do you know what Felony Act number 2 is? The indictment describes Felony Act number 2 as, quote, on or about the 15th day of November 2020, Rudolph Louis Giuliani placed a telephone call to unindicted co-conspirator Individual 2, whose identity is known to the grand jury, and left an approximately 83-second-long voicemail message for unindicted co-conspirator Individual 2, making statements concerning fraud in the November 3rd, 2020 election in Fulton County, Georgia. This telephone call was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. End quote. Felonious Act number 3, which is erroneously listed as a second Act number 2, with no Act 3 at all because the prosecutor was in such a hurry to release it so as to keep Biden's crimes out of the news that they didn't proofread it. But Act 2 is about allegedly false words spoken at a press conference at the Republican National Committee headquarters on behalf of the Trump campaign. Really? So false words spoken by or on behalf of a politician campaign are now felonies? Well, we'd have no one left to serve in office. Any office. From any party. The felony described as Act 6, it reads, quote, on or about the 21st day of November 2020, Mark Randall Meadows sent a text message to United States Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania and stated, quote, this is his text in quotations, can you send me the number for the Speaker and the leader of PA legislature? POTUS wants to chat with them. That's the end of the text quote. But continuing with the indictment, quote, "This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy," end quote. So apparently, asking for someone's phone number is now a felony. Act 22 makes a tweet a felony. It reads, quote, "On or about the 3rd day of December 2020, Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account @RealDonaldTrump," quoting the tweet itself, in quotation marks here in the indictment. "Georgia hearings now on @OANN. Amazing," end tweet quote. Continuing now with the indictment quote. "This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy," end quote. So now notifying your Twitter followers that a news channel is televising government hearings in Georgia is a crime? Seriously, I'm not making any of this up. This is honestly what the indictment calls felonies. Act numbers 22, 26, 27, 32, 38, 75, 100, 101, 106, 114, 128, 138, and 139 are all about tweets that Fani Willis wants to criminalize. There is no way those survive constitutional scrutiny. Every one of the 161 acts described in the indictment is followed by the words, "overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy." So the acts themselves are perfectly legal. But because she didn't like what Trump and his associates were trying to accomplish, that being to expose election fraud they genuinely believed occurred, she grouped all those actions as felony acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. So individual acts were not crimes, but collectively they were? Yeah, that's the basis for many of the felony charges. And many of the listed acts didn't even take place in Georgia. So there's jurisdictional problems with pursuing them in a Georgia courtroom. Act 28 says, quote, "On or about the 3rd day of December 2020, Donald John Trump met with Speaker of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives Brian Cutler in the Oval Office at the White House and discussed holding a special session of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy," end quote. So now conversations by the President of the United States while in the Oval Office that pertain to actions in Pennsylvania, not Georgia, can be prosecuted as felonies by a district attorney in Atlanta? And the indictment got worse and worse as I read it. It would be a joke if it wasn't such a serious affront to the rule of law and our republic. But remember, getting convictions on all counts is not the goal here. Destroying Trump's chances of winning the 2024 presidential election is the goal. So piling on specious charges helps achieve that objective, even if they don't ultimately get convictions on all of them. There's not time to list every act the indictment claims were overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, but I did tally the offenses. Of the 161 acts the prosecutor lists in her indictment as felonies, Donald Trump is accused of committing 43 of them, so it's about 25% of them. And this is the summary of his so-called offenses. 12 are tweets. 2 are nationally televised public speeches. One was on November 4th, and the other was the January 6th speech at the Ellipse in Washington. 1 was an official statement released by the Trump campaign. 9 were meetings or telephone conversations that occurred somewhere outside Georgia's borders and that had absolutely nothing to do with Georgia. 12 were meetings or telephone conversations that occurred somewhere outside Georgia's borders but did pertain to Georgia. 6 were meetings or telephone conversations that occurred somewhere outside Georgia's borders in which no state was specified in the indictment. Trump's only so-called offense that does not meet one of those parameters was Act number 108, which was a court filing in Atlanta contesting Georgia's election results. So Willis wants Trump sent to prison for exercising his First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So to summarize, every single allegation against Donald Trump is something that is a constitutionally protected right guaranteed by the First Amendment. Now, to be clear, some of Willis's listed acts do allege perjury by Kathleen Latham and by Robert Cheeley. And there are acts alleging Rudy Giuliani made false statements, though not ones that could be considered perjury. But remember, the target here is Donald Trump. And every single act the indictment says Donald Trump did was a completely legal act. But taken together, they constituted overt acts in furtherance of a conspiracy. In simple terms, Donald Trump committed no criminal acts at all, but together they were all criminal. Yeah, that really is the best summation of the 98-page indictment. Don't believe me? Go read it yourself, because the fake news sure as hell ain't going to tell you that truth. So where do we go from here? More specifically, where does this nation go from here? I'll address that when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Facing simultaneous felony cases in 4 different cities, no less, would be daunting for anyone. But in addition to having to deal with defending himself against these charges, Donald Trump is also running a campaign for the presidency of the United States. And while, yeah, he's got lawyers handling the criminal cases, they'll still require some of his time, attention, and money. Not to mention perhaps his physical presence in perhaps multiple courtrooms during the campaign season. Can you think of a more effective way to weaken your political opponent than that? Included in the 91 felony charges against him, Donald Trump has been charged with violating RICO statutes. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. Essentially, it's a charge that alleges an organized conspiracy. But is not what the Demon Rats have done since 2016 an organized conspiracy? It absolutely is. Is it a criminal conspiracy? Probably, but we'll never know that via any judicial action because the Demon Rat conspirators will never be held to account for their persecution of Donald Trump. In fact, they'll be celebrated for it. It's truly disgusting. And it's going to hasten the demise of our republic. When the power of the government, in this case 2 states, New York and Georgia, along with the nearly unlimited power of the federal government, concentrate their efforts to destroy their leading political opponent, this nation is doomed. And if being doomed by stealing the 2020 and 2024 elections isn't bad enough, just wait until some of Trump's supporters eventually reach the conclusion that the laws have been so violated and abused by officials who have sworn oaths to uphold the Constitution that they believe only violence can restore order. And so they resort to violence against the government. Now, to be clear, I don't want that. And I'm not advocating that. But if it happens, it will just as much be the fault of the criminals in government as it will be the fault of the criminals who resort to violence against the government. As President John Adams said, we are supposed to have a government of laws, not men, because a government of laws acts in the interest of all. A government of men acts in the interest of a select few. A government of laws is concerned with what's right. A government of men is concerned with power. And that power is always abused to suppress those not in power. As President Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Now, he was referring to circumstances in Latin American nations. But those words similarly apply in this country as well. Those who allow our Constitution to be flagrantly violated will make an attempt at its violent restoration inevitable. So whether you like Donald Trump or not, if you care at all about the future of this nation, if you care at all for the Constitution of the United States, if you do not want to see this country sink into despotic tyranny where the power of government is abused by men of one untouchable ruling party, if you have any decency about you, you cannot support what the Democrats and their allies in the propaganda press have done to Donald Trump. Now, I'm on the record not wanting Donald Trump back in the White House. But if he loses because of all these political prosecutions, or more accurately, when he loses because of all these political prosecutions, we're done. And no decent American wants that. Which is, I suppose, why the Democrats do want it. I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.